Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm a specialist in the Old Norse language, currently finishing up 2 years of teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, before moving in fall of 2017 home to the Rocky Mountains to teach at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Back today with another video about a topic in Norse language and myth, and what I want to do today is continue with my remade Old Norse lessons. As I mentioned in my video that I did a couple weeks ago, revisiting the introductory facts about Old Norse nouns, I am not ordering these lessons in any kind of numerical format, so you can go and look at them in whatever order you please. In this video, what I'm going to do is take a look at the basic facts about verbs, how they're organized, what the different endings you can expect for different types are, and as much as possible, I'm going to do that with reference to English, not only as a closely related language to Old Norse, but also as a reference point that I assume anyone who's listening to me has some familiarity with. So let's take a look first at verbs in English, because this is a good launching point for understanding verbs in Old Norse. If we take a typical verb in English, we see not a large variety of different endings, even if the verb serves many different purposes. So here's drive. This is a typical strong verb in English, and I'll get in a minute to what I mean by strong and weak verb. We see that in the present tense, we have 6 possible categories of subject. This first person singular, I, second person singular, you, third person singular, she, he, it, or any given thing, a book, a Viking, the sword, whatever. First person plural, we, second person plural. English doesn't have an agreed upon way of saying this, but some American dialects use y'all, which is convenient for keeping this separate. And then they, third person plural. Of course, you can replace that with books, students, ravens, whatever. But there's only one form of the verb here that's actually different from the other ones, and that's the third person singular, where an S is added. This is quite different, of course, from the situation in, say, Spanish, where you have different endings for these categories. In the past tense, there's no difference at all. The past tense is the same no matter what the subject is. So even though the third person singular is drives, you say the man drives, but I drive. In the past tense, there's no distinction. The man drove, but I drove. English has a present participle formed by adding ing to the root form. This is actually something that can distract you when trying to figure out other Indo-European languages, because most Indo-European languages, including Old Norse, don't use participles the way that English does to make a present progressive verb. So for instance, I can say I drive in English, but I'm actually more likely to say I'm driving if I'm describing something that's going on in the present. Old Norse and most Indo-European languages don't do that. The only equivalent that you can say to that is like I drive, right? So keep that in mind. Don't try to translate word for word I am driving. Translate that as I drive. And then there's a past participle, driven, I have driven, who has driven here, whatever. There are also imperative forms. These are command forms. So drive, if I'm talking to you when trying to get away from my latest bank heist. Or if I'm talking to 2 people who are having a race, I might say drive. Notice there's not a difference if I'm telling one person versus multiple people to drive in English. And then what we can consider a first person plural imperative, let's drive, right? Speaking to someone else that I'm including in that action along with me. And then there's the subjunctive. This is mostly a dead category in English except for one verb, the verb to be. So if he drives here today, this just ends up looking like the normal present. The subjunctive in a language like Old Norse or Old English or even early modern English expresses something that is not necessarily a true indication of fact. So if he drives here today, he hasn't driven here. He's not driving here as far as I know. But if he does, right, it's something that's conditional on some kind of potential reality, and it doesn't actually describe a reality. So in some languages, including Old Norse, there's a different verb ending for that. And the same thing in the past tense. If I drove there, I could. I haven't driven there. I did not drive there yet. But were I to do so, right, potentially, hypothetically, that's a place where I would use a past subjunctive in Old Norse. Another thing to keep in mind, I mentioned that you should not think of the participle in Old Norse. If you want to translate, like I am driving, you should translate that as I drive. But keep in mind too that English has a special, if you will, sort of interrogative form of the verb. Notice that in English, I don't say drive you, I say do you drive, right? I use this sort of dummy verb do that takes that gives it an interrogative force that makes it a question, right? I don't say drove you, I say did you drive, so using the past tense of do there as well. This is very unusual. This is not something you'll see in other Indo-European languages for the most part, this sort of dummy verb. And of course in older English it's not there. If you look at the early modern Shakespeare, King James layer of the language, you'll see questions sometimes phrased just by reversing the verb and the subject. So drove you as a question, did you drive? And Old Norse is going to phrase questions that way. So instead of saying the equivalent of, do y'all drive every day on Sunday, you say drive y'all every day on Sunday, every Sunday, whatever. Notice that if you look up a verb in English in the dictionary, the form that you're going to find is the infinitive. So the infinitive is sort of, you can consider it like the base form of the verb, even though technically it has an ending to in Old Norse. The infinitive is the form that you use in English with modal verbs like will, can, should. So I will go, I will drive, I can drive, I should drive, something like that. It's the form that goes with those modal verbs like that. It's also the form that follows to in a question like to be or not to be. So to drive is a privilege, not a right, or something like that. You're using the infinitive with to, and the to almost makes it like a noun that can be used as the subject of a verb, right? To drive is a privilege. All right, so this is a, quote, strong verb in English. Let's look at a weak verb in English as well. All right, now this is walk, which is a weak verb. The difference is, in traditional Germanic language studies, we call strong verbs the verbs in Germanic languages like English, Old Norse, German, that have a past tense formed by changing the vowel and the root of the word. So drive, past tense, drove, that's a strong verb. Ride, past tense, rode, that's a strong verb. Take, past tense, took, that's a strong verb. But weak verbs are the verbs that form their past tense by adding a dental consonant in the ending. So in English that means a D or a T. Typically it's spelled as ED in English. And so Old Norse has those equivalent categories, strong and weak. And usually what's a strong verb in English will also be a strong verb in Old Norse and vice versa. Not always, but the languages are closely enough related that it does work out often. So notice that in English, a weak verb doesn't have really different categories than the strong verb. It doesn't in Old Norse either. And for the most part, the differences are pretty minor. Notice the present works the same way. There's just a third person singular where you add S, whereas you don't add S in any of the other forms. The past tense is formed differently from a strong verb. It's formed by adding a suffix, in this case ed, walked versus walk. It's the same for all the past tense forms, just like a strong verb. Participle is formed by adding ing to the root. The past participle of a weak verb in English is typically identical to the regular past tense. So I walked and I have walked, as opposed to a strong verb, I drove and I have driven. Imperative is usually just the bare root. Walk, right? If I'm telling you to keep walking or whatever. Same if I'm talking to multiple people, or let's walk. And then subjunctive, again, a dead category. If he walks here today, no different from the normal indicative verb form. If I walked there, I could. No different from the normal indicative verb form. And again, when you look this up in the dictionary, you'll see the infinitive, which in English is just typically the bare root, walk. All right. Now, there are two other major categories that I want to introduce to you. And the third category, then major category verbs I want to look at is the preterite present verb, which is also a real thing in English today still too. All right, now can is a preterite present verb. Notice that in English these verbs typically are lacking whole categories of inflection. So there's not really an infinitive. There's no way you can say to can. I mean, you end up rephrasing this by using other expressions like to be able. The main distinction of a preterite present verb is that in the third person singular in English, notice how there's no S, right? I can do it, you can do it, he can do it. He doesn't say, we don't say he cans do it, right? And so these verbs include in English, and not necessarily in Old Norse, because these categories don't always overlap, but like he will, not he wills, he shall, not he shalls, to the extent that shall is even a living word anymore. He ought, that kind of thing. This isn't a huge category in English, but it's a fairly big category in Old Norse, so it's worth mentioning. The reason that they don't have the third person singular S in English is that these endings are historically past tense strong verb endings. In Old Norse, the present tense of a preterite present verb looks like the past tense of a strong verb. That's the reason for the name. Preterite is a linguistic term for past tense, so these things they look like past tense and they're present tense. And the reason for that is that the past tense in Germanic languages like English and Old Norse comes from a perfect aspect in Proto-Indo-European, which doesn't exactly indicate past action, but rather completed action. So these verbs maintain that distinction of talking about a completed action, the knowledge of how to do something in the case of this verb, or completed state, such as an obligation, that it's not past tense, but it has endings of a past tense because the past tense endings come from something that actually originally just indicated completion rather than past. At any rate, this still has some relevance for English grammar today. Past tense, just like with regular weak and strong verbs, there's no difference between any of these forms, the same for everything. The way that past tense are formed in preterite present verbs tends to be like weak verbs, although it can often be a little bit different. I mean, there's no way you could really predict the past tense of can as could if you were learning English from scratch. We don't really usually have participles or imperatives for these things in English. I can't say can, right? I might be able to say be able, but then I'm just rephrasing with another verb. And similarly, again, I can express a subjunctive, a non-factual state, if he can be here today, if I could be there, but I'm not using different forms of the verb, unlike how I would do in Old Norse. Now, one last big category that I want to look at in English to get this ball rolling for Old Norse is the weirdest verb in pretty much any language, the verb to be. Now, the verb to be, the copula verb, tends to be irregular in all the Indo-European languages. And one of the driving forces behind that is that more frequent words tend to maintain more archaic lexical material or morphological material, i.e., the words that you use a lot are the words you're likely to remember weird things about. If I were to tell you that, there's a new word that I'm going to give you, and it's a word for succeeding at all your dreams. And this word, I tell you, this verb is fleck. To fleck is to succeed at all your dreams. And I tell you the past tense of fleck is floke, right? Irregular. It's not what you'd expect. If I just gave you a new verb, you would expect the past fleck. You'd expect the past tense to be flecked, right? But I tell you, no, it's floke. Well, how often does anybody get to talk about achieving all their dreams, right? You're going to forget the details of this verb because you're not going to say it that much. There's not many reasons to say it. And so probably 12 years from now when you say, oh, I wish that and you want to use the past tense of this verb, you're going to say, I wish that I flecked, right? You're going to forget that weird past tense that I told you. It's just not something you say very often. But if I tell you that fleck means to eat, and maybe I'm cool enough that I can actually sort of establish new vocabulary in the language and everybody starts saying, I'm flecking, instead of I'm eating. And I tell you the past tense is floke, you're going to say that often enough. We talk about eating all the time, right? What did you eat for lunch? What did you eat for dinner? What are you going to eat for breakfast tomorrow? You might actually remember the past tense for float. So common words tend to maintain more irregular forms just because they're in more circulation. And of course, what verb is used more often than the basic verb that means something is, right? The verb to be. And so English is no exception here. The verb to be maintains some very archaic linguistic material, some categories that aren't even there in other verbs in our language. And it's a good last thing to look at in English before jumping into Old Norse. So notice already in the present singular, there's 3 different forms here, right? Your average verb has 2 forms, a first and second and then a third, but English to be is the only verb in our language that has a separate form for all 3 of these. I am, you are, he is. Notice this isn't necessary, right? From a normal English verbs point of view, there's no reason why I couldn't say I be, you be, she bees, right? I mean, that would actually, it's understandable if I say it. There's a conceivable future where English could work that way, but it doesn't. We've maintained these more complicated categories because the word is so frequent. In the plural, all the forms are the same, are. And in the past tense, we also see distinctions that aren't made in any other verb in the language. I was, but you were. But she was, and then were, all in the plural. We also have, I forgot to write in the participles. We also have participles being and the past participle been. We have imperative be kind, rewind, or I could say the same thing to multiple people, or let's be friends, or let's be enemies if you're riding the bus in Berkeley. And the subjunctive category is actually preserved to an extent in this verb, one of the very few places you'll ever see it in English. So typically if I'm talking about something that I don't expect, if he is here today, right? That sounds like normal English today. If he is here today, we'll have a lecture. If I'm not expecting him to be here today, if this is sort of a counterfactual if, older English, even early 20th century writers can sometimes actually use be here, and that's a subjunctive. If he be here today, and earlier modern English expresses more doubt about him being here. So if he be here today, I'm not really expecting it. If he is here today, he probably will be. Surviving a little bit better in English today is the past subjunctive of to be. So if I say, if I was there, that sounds like I'm more likely to be there than the old subjunctive form, which is if I were there, right? This is something that a lot of English teachers really get on about. You know, use were with if because it expresses actual, like a more hypothetical and less truthfully potential situation. A lot of English speakers don't actually make the distinction, but just sort of use were as the if form. But in origin, what this is a fossilized subjunctive, a fossilized form of the verb that shows less commitment to the truth value of a statement. So now I'll sort of start going backwards in a sense, looking at Old Norse verb endings. Let's start with be because the endings are actually going to be more like the endings in English than they are in the other verbs because this is such an archaic verb in English. All right, these are the endings of the verb to be in Old Norse. There is an earlier layer of endings that we see in text from before about the year 1200, and then there are endings that we see after about the year 1200. I'm giving both layers here because often what drives people to an interest in Old Norse is an interest in the Viking Age. And so the earlier endings would have been used back then. But in fact, most of our texts are written during the 1200s when the later endings are normal. So they're the endings that you'll normally see when you're reading Old Norse. The infinitive, the earlier infinitive, so pre-12, when I say earlier, I'm talking pre-1200, later be post-1200. Earlier infinitive is vesa, this later becomes vera. Basically what happens in the transition from earlier to later endings is that a lot of forms of s get replaced with an r. This is not that unusual of an infinitive in the sense that it ends in a, the letter a. The vast majority of infinitives with a few exceptions in Old Norse, are forms that end in a. And then we have forms that don't look too different from English in a lot of cases. So I am, ek am, clearly related to English I am. Thu ert, thou art. And then the archaic form of is, I've used she here, hon es, she is. Not very different from English, is. Now, after 1200, this becomes so you get hon she is. That's what you'll usually see when you're reading Old Norse. Some handbooks will also mention an older form est for ert. My very first published paper was actually about this. I don't believe that est actually existed in the history of Old West Norse, which is what we're dealing with when we're talking about reading Old Norse texts, so I'm not including it here. Then in the plural, we see that unlike in English where there would be just one form for all three of these, right? We are, y'all are, they are. There's distinct forms of Old Norse. So ver, erum, that's we are. Or later, ther, this thorn gets added to the end, to the beginning of that word, also around 1200. So earlier, ther later, that's y'all in Old Norse, multiple u. Ther eru, y'all are. And then thær eru. There's a different form for the word they, whether it's masculine, feminine, or plural. I'll mix things up a little bit. This is feminine, thær, so multiple women or multiple feminine objects like books. They are. So notice we have 6 distinct forms, where English, where this is the maximally distinct verb, has 4. Then in the past tense, we have 5 distinct forms. Ek was, obviously related to English was. This becomes var after 1200. Thu vast, you were. This becomes vart after 1200. And hon was, she was. This becomes hon var after 1200. And then the plural, ver vorum, we were. There voru, y'all were. There voru, they were. Now, notice actually that this alternation between s in the singular and r in the plural is the result of something called Werner's law that operated in conjunction in some way with Grimm's law in the early history of the Germanic languages. In English, the relationship between was and were is a reflection of the operation of that same law. Notice the s in the singular and the r in the plural in English and Old Norse, even though in Old Norse the s in the singular gets replaced by an r later. Also notice that in this video, as in all the videos on this channel, the pronunciation that I use in Old Norse is reconstructed pronunciation, so roughly the pronunciation of the time when the texts were written in the 1200s. There's also modern Icelandic pronunciation, which is what's used by most instructors and textbooks, but I prefer the less anachronistic reconstructed pronunciation. I have a video about that if you've missed it. I'll link in the top right corner of a card. And I also have a video on my channel about the pronunciation of modern Icelandic if you're more interested in doing it that way. Either way is legitimate. All right. This verb also has a participle. It'd be equivalent to being, right? The earlier form is vesandi, later form is verandi. The past participle, been, right? I have been, forms of verið. Now the past participle is an adjective, or its endings are adjective-like. We're not going to get into adjectives in this video because that will be a whole other video, how adjectives work video, where I'll discuss how the endings of past participles are done. The imperative, we actually have different forms for this, for all 3 of these categories, unlike in English where it's just one. So if I want to tell one person to be good, say ves goður, maybe if I'm talking to one man. Multiple people, be good. If I'm talking to multiple men, verið góðir, be good, a command. Or let's be good, talking about myself and some other men, verum góðir. All right, let's be good. This is the first person plural imperative. The subjunctive has a whole separate set of endings. So these are the indicative or normal verb endings. And then there's a whole separate set for subjunctive, for a verb that does not have a committed truth value. I'm not going to go into that. I'll have to do a separate video about subjunctives, but this is a preview. Ek hygg at það sé, so I think that it is. This is the subjunctive form of is, the third person singular. This would be used if the truth value isn't known. So I think it, but I don't know it. Ek hygg at það væri, I think that it was. Again, I don't know that it was, so this goes into the subjunctive because its truth value is not established. All right, so vesa or vera is the most unusual verb in the language. This is not how most verbs work. Let's take a look at a more normal verb. Let's look first at a weak verb of the kind that I call the I-type for convenience sake. Now, höra is a weak verb. It forms its past tense by adding a suffix with a dental consonant, dt, or in the case of Old Norse, eth, the medieval curly D with a slash that indicates the TH sound in worthy or breathing or then. This is the type of verb that I typically teach first in an Old Norse class because there are many useful basic verbs that follow this pattern. And the pattern is fairly easy to remember as far as these things go and doesn't have too many unusual exceptions. I usually use the term I-type weak verb when I'm teaching Old Norse from a synchronic perspective because the I that appears in the present singular, right? So ek høyrir, þú høyrir, han høyrir. So let's look at how this works. Infinitive is an this is the verb for to hear, like I hear a sound. Ek høyrir, I hear, þú høyrir, you hear, han høyrir, he hears. Typically, in most verbs, except for vera, to be, present verbs, the second and third person singular is the same, and it ends in an R. Ver høyrum, we hear. Þeir høyrið, they hear, y'all hear. And þeir høyra, they hear. These endings, id, a, for the plural present, are going to be the same for all verbs again, except vera, to be, and the preterite present verbs. So you can always kind of fill in this part of the square with id, a. Past tense for this I-type weak verb, we have ek hørða. Notice that we add that eth before we add these endings. The eth has been added to the root. To get the root of the verb, you just take the infinitive a off of it, so the root is hør. You just take that root, you add the eth, and then you add a, ir, I, ud, u. This will also be how A-type weak verbs work with another letter inserted before the eth, as we'll see. So ek hørða, I heard, þú hørðir, you heard, han hørði, he heard, ver hørðum, we heard, þeir hørðuð, y'all heard, and þeir hørðu, they, masculine, heard. Notice, very similar to the cognate English verb hear, where it's also a weak verb that adds a D or T to indicate past tense. Like other verbs, the present participle, hearing, a machine that, I don't know, a hearing machine or something like that. It's hard to think of context for this in a language that doesn't use participles in verb phrases, right? In Old Norse, remember, you don't say I'm hearing, you just say I hear. But anyway, like other verbs, it's andi plus the root. The past participle is an adjective heard, something I've heard. This adds that eth for the past tense, and then adjective endings, which we'll talk about in another video. The imperative command, hear me, hør, so just the bare root of the verb. Remember, that's the infinitive minus a. The second person plural is typically identical to the normal indicative form, so I'm talking to many people saying, hear me, hørið. Or the first person plural imperative, let's hear, let's listen, hørum. There are also, of course, going to be subjunctive endings for statements that I'm not certain of the truth of. So, ek hygg at han høyrir, I think that he hears, using the subjunctive ending høyrir instead of the normal ending høyrir because I'm not sure about what he hears. Ek hygg at han hørði, same thing in the past tense, but in the past tense, subjunctive in weak verbs typically is going to look the same as the indicative form. So if you take another verb in Old Norse that is an I-type weak verb, gera, to do, veiða, to hunt, many others, you can plug it into these endings. Just take the hør off, insert the root from the other verb, and you've got the endings for that verb. So geri, gerir, gerir, gerum, geri, gera. Gerða, gerðir, gerði, gerðum, gerðuð, gerðu. There are exceptions to this in the form of what exact consonant is added after the root to form the past tense. So sometimes that will be a D, sometimes it will be a T, and it can actually be fairly hard to predict which one it's going to show up as. However, most Old Norse dictionaries, when they show you a verb, they'll list it under the infinitive, and in parentheses or something afterwards, they'll typically give you the first person past tense or the third person past tense. Either way, you'll see which one of these to add. So for a verb like mala, to speak, it's an I-type work verb, so you know that the present tense is mali, maliter, maliter, malu, malid, mala. But the past tense adds a T, so you get malta, maltir, malti, maltum, maltuth, maltu. Same endings, just what's coming between the root and these endings is a different dental consonant. If you want to practice doing this, Patreon supporters are welcome to write to me either on Patreon messages or by email, and sort of saying, all right, am I doing this verb right? Or you can ask me to give you some verbs, and you can test yourself in doing them, and in using dictionaries, because that, of course, is part of the skill of Old Norse, is learning how to use a dictionary, like the Cleesby-Vickerson dictionary that's online in several places. All right, let's look then at another type of weak verb, the type that I call the A-type weak verbs. All right, kalla, to call, is what I call an A-type weak verb. The reason is, in the present tense, you can see the system is very similar to an I-type weak verb like höra, to hear, but where that adds an I in the present singular, right? Höri, hörir, hörir. This adds an A, so ek kalla, I call, thu kallar, you call, that kallar, it calls. But as I mentioned before, the plural present endings are the same for all verbs. So ver kolum, ver kalid, thou kalla. Now in my video about how nouns work, I mentioned the rule called i-mutation, or i-umlaut, which states that in Old Norse you cannot have a word that has an A in a stressed syllable, and the first syllable is always stressed, and a U in a following syllable, the same word. The U will always change a preceding A to o-kaudata, the hook O. So this is a normal, regular operation of a rule in Old Norse. Because this would have been an A, this would be kalum. If this rule didn't operate, the U changes the A into the hook O. Now in the past tense, if you just start by looking at the ev, right, tha, thir, thee, thum, thu, thu, that looks just like an I-type weak verb like höra. The difference with your A-type weak verbs is that they add an A before that ev in the past tense singular. So ek kallada, I called. Thu kalladir, there's a dove trying to break into my window. Thu kalladir, you called. Thought kalladi, it called. And then in the past tense, a U is added before that ev. So ver koludum, notice also with that mutation of A to hook O. Ver koludum, we called. Ver koluduð, y'all called. Thou koludu, they, neuter or mixed gender, called. Participle looks the same as any other verb, root plus andi. The past participle will also have this difference from the I-type weak verbs. It will have an A inserted between the root and the ev that marks the past tense, and then we'll have adjectival endings we'll discuss in another video. The imperative of this type tends to look just like the imperative, so kalla, call, call out to someone. Kali, telling several people to call out. Kolum, let's call out. Which looks, of course, the second plural and first plural imperatives look just like the first plural and second plural indicative in verbs other than, of course, the to be verb, which is always weird. Then there will be distinct disjunctive endings. Ik hig at han kalli. I think that he calls. I think he is calling. I'm using a subjunctive ending rather than the normal indicative ending because I'm not sure of the truth value. And ik hig at han kallavi. I think that he called, but I'm not sure. Typically with weak verbs, the subjunctive is the same as the indicative for the past singular. All right. So A-type weak verbs are actually probably the very easiest in the entire language. If you look up a verb and it's an A-type weak verb, like atla, to intend, it is going to work just like this. It's going to be ek, atla, atlar, atlar, atlum, atlid, atla, atlava, atlavir, atlavi, atlavum, atlavuth, atlavu. It is going to be exactly the same workings as kala. These are the most frequent verbs in the language. If you pick up an Old Norse dictionary and you just open it up to a random page and you pick the first verb you see, the odds are more than any other single category it would be one of these types of verbs. That doesn't mean that this is the most common verb. Remember that common verbs tend to maintain more irregular features, right? And this is very regular. It just means that if a new verb is imported into the language, it's more likely to go into this category. And there are certainly several important verbs that fall into this category too. For the most part, in an Old Norse dictionary, you will be able to look up a verb, find its infinitive like kala, and to figure out what type of verb it is, it'll usually show you in parentheses or something, the past first singular or third singular. It'll say kalava or kalavi. The fact that you've got that a before the ev in the past tense will show you that it's an A-type weak verb that works like this. Now, strong verbs are a little bit different. Let's take a look at a sample strong verb. All right, now geva, to give, is a typical strong verb. Specifically, it's a class 5 strong verb. You'll notice that the infinitive ends in a, the letter a, like with the other verbs. And notice too that in the present singular, you have a similar pattern to the weak verbs. Weak verbs, of course, have I, ir, or a, ar, ar. But instead of an I or an A coming after the root, you just have nothing. So you have simply ek gev, with no vowel after it, I give. And then thu gevr, hon gevr, you give, she gives, with no vowel between the root and the R that marks the second and third person singular ending. We then see the typical plural present endings, il, a, vergevum, we give, ther gevith, jag give, thir geva, they, feminine, give. But then in the past tense, notice we are beyond the familiar eth or t or d that we add to the past tense in a weak verb. Instead, we just take the root and change its vowel and then add some other endings. So this is, of course, similar to English. You can recognize geva as give and gav as gave. So in the same way, Old Norse says geva gav, the way English says give gave, right? And there is, to a degree, a predictable way of figuring out what this change will be, which I'll get to. But let's look at the endings. The first and third singular past tense of a strong verb look the same. Ek gav, hon gav, I gave, she gave, same form. The second person singular, however, does add a T, so thu gaft, you gave. And then in the past tense plural, I wrote an A there instead of a U. We have u, which we also have in the weak verbs, just of course, as there. So golvum, ver golvum, we gave, there golvuth, y'all gave, and thir golvu. Why did I write this as a present? This is what I get for, I don't know, trying to make such a long video. They gave, thir golvu, they, feminine, gave. Present participle, same as normal. Andi plus the root, gevandi. The past participle, however, of strong verbs is not formed with an ev like it is in the weak verbs. It is formed with a suffix in, which of course is related to the suffix that is in most strong verb past participles in English. Given is cognate with English given. The command form imperative is just the bare root, like it is in I-type weak verbs. Give, give. Give is for the plural. I'm telling multiple people to give. Let's give. Gevum looks like the first person plural. The subjunctive is formed by adding an I in the third person singular. These are just examples because there's more subjunctive forms. Ek hig at han givi, I think that he gives. The past tense, however, notice this is actually different in strong verbs from the indicative, which usually isn't in weak verbs. Ek hig at han gavi. All right, so this is a whole different vowel that's going on here. Now, with strong verbs that have a front vowel in the root, so strong verbs that have an E in the root, or an I, or a long E or long I, or the combination EI, this system will work for the present tense endings. So for instance, there's driva to drive. You would say ek driv, du driver, hon driver, ver drivum, der drivid, thir driva. All right. The past tense would be different because they're different classes of strong verbs. But to actually understand the present tense of the vast majority of strong verbs, you have to understand another vowel mutation that affects them. And this is the so-called i-mutation or i-umlaut. So we talked about u-mutation or u-umlaut, where u changes an a in front of it in a word into a hook o. I-mutation is a way that an I or J, which is usually not there in the language anymore, has mutated a vowel in front of it in a word. So let's look at how I-mutation works. All right, to talk about I-umlaut or I-mutation, we first have to talk about where vowels are made in your mouth. So I've drawn a mouth, which I realize looks more like a bird's beak, but birds are the only thing I know how to draw. And in the back of the mouth, I have put the back vowels of Old Norse. So U, O, short A, and long A. I'm writing them differently because they have sort of different outcomes in I-mutation in Old West Norse and O-Kaudata hook O. And then in the front of the mouth, I have the front vowels. So the E, A, sounds, and then the rounded front vowels E and I. All right, now notice when I say front and back of the mouth, I mean that literally. If you try saying the oo sound, ooh, and then say the e sound, e, and then go back and forth between them, ooh, e, ooh, e, ooh, e, you can feel your tongue sliding forward and backward in your mouth. So what's going on in I-mutation or I-umlaut is that the I or J that was in an ending syllable in some earlier stage of the language has moved a back vowel forward in the mouth and turned it into a front vowel. Typically U becomes Y, O becomes /O, short A becomes E, and long A becomes ash. Short O will also go with short A, typically, and become an E. This has affected English too, although of course English and Old Norse take somewhat different roots here. One word where this has affected both English and Old Norse is man. Notice that the plural is men, just like in, say, Norwegian, the singular is man and the plural is men, right? The same distinction of plurality is indicated by the same change of vowel. And what that is that vowel going further forward in the mouth in the plural. Why is that? Well, if we look at Old Norse as an example, although these ancestor forms apply to English too, the singular at a Proto-Norse, Proto-Germanic level, late Proto-Germanic, Proto-Norse would be mans, the plural men would be manis. At a certain stage in the history of both Norse and English, the I in the ending is going to move that A front in the mouth by I-mutation and turn it into an E. At that point, the ending drops out because the plural is now indicated by the change vowel. You don't need the extra syllable to indicate the plural, and so you get men, which is the Old Norse plural of mother, which means man. Here this looks weird in Old Norse because N and R regularly becomes Edar in the history of Old Norse. That's man, plural, men. Same thing as in English. The I that used to be there changed the A into an E. Now this affects strong verbs quite a bit because in Proto-Norse, strong verbs in the present singular had an I that caused i-mutation on the root of the verb. So, for instance, if we look at, I haven't written the pronouns in Proto-Norse forms, those are just there to remind you what the forms are. And if I write these verb forms in Proto-Norse, so Old Norse, probably before the Viking Age, we have an I in the ending for you. This is the verb to rule, roda, so you rule, he rules, thu radis, han radis. At a certain step, that I fronts that long A, it turns it into an ash. And that I drops out in the history of Old Norse, so that in the Old Norse text that we have, we never see an I there, it's just the R right after the root. But the mutation caused by the I remains. This mutation is not actually expected in the first person singular. We would, because there's not an I there in Proto-Norse, we'd expect this to just be ek roð, but it's not in Old Norse. The mutated vowel is moved up by analogy from the second and third person singulars. So you get, in Old Norse, ek rad, thu rather, han rather. I rule, you rule, he rules. Notice that this doesn't affect anywhere in the plural because none of the endings in Proto-Norse have an I. Even though in the Old Norse text we actually read by that stage of the language, the 1100s and 1200s, there is an I in the second person plural. But that's from an E in Proto-Norse. That was an E when this change happened, so it doesn't cause the change of long A to ash, because it's an I that's too late for the change. The change is no longer operative in the language. It's had its effects and it's disappeared. So this will affect most strong verbs because if they don't have a root in I or E, they're going to have a root that has a back vowel in it, and that's going to be turned into a front vowel in their present singular form, like roða is turned into rad. So let me give you, if this visualization doesn't help or just to kind of reinforce it, let me give you a list of the changes that happen by i-mutation. Alright, so here's a chart that shows the effects of i-mutation or i-umlaut. Typically a short A becomes a short E, so a verb like taka, the present singular, ek, tek, I take, rather than ek tak. Long A would become ash, so roda, as we saw on the previous board, ek, rad, I rule, to rule, I rule. I couldn't think of verbs with short O or long O in the root, but short O typically becomes either /O or an E. What am I talking about? I could find this verb. Anyway, koma, to come, the present tense, then a kim or a kem. You see both forms. Kim tends to be a little bit earlier or in more easterly texts. These are the two I couldn't find verb examples for. Long O becomes long /O, also sometimes written as an OE together. So for instance, fotr, foot, the plural in Old Norse has i-umlaut, it's hytr, feet. And then short U become a short Y, so sunr, this is one form of the word for son, as in father and son, plural sinir. Long U becomes long Y, so the verb snua, to turn, I turn, be exni, long Y instead of long U. AU together becomes what the two constituent parts become, EY together. So auka, to increase. We have our present first person singular, ik, I increase. Yo, J plus long O together becomes long Y. So kyosa, to choose. We get ekkis, I choose. And U, J and long U together becomes long Y too. So smurha, which is to creep, the verb related to smegel, which J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, used to describe a creepy character, becomes in the first person singular, I creep, precious. So the changes that you see here will also apply to any other strong verb that has this particular vowel in its root. So for instance, the verb lota, to let, the first person form will be ek, lat, with this mutated form. The verb bjoda, to invite, will have this mutated verb vowel in its first person singular form, so bioda, ek, bi, etc. I-mutation is quite regular, but it does, it can make forms of words look unfamiliar. It can make it difficult to figure out what particular word you're looking at or what to look up in the dictionary, unless you get used to these alternations. So if you're working hard on learning Old Norse, I would recommend making flashcards that show a particular vowel and then what it becomes under I-mutation, but also show yourself the result and remember what that result can come from by I-mutation, because if you come across an unfamiliar word, say you're reading Old Norse and you see like exni, you need to know that, of course, you might look up snia and not see anything. You might need to look up snua, because that might come from a long Y created by mutation from long U. Or, of course, before you learn more vocabulary, you might need to look up snioa or snua, because it could hypothetically come from that too, because that can also be an i-umlaut mutation from yo or you. So, good thing to sort of flashcard drill yourself about. Alright, so let's look at some strong verbs that are affected by I-mutation in this way. Alright, so this is a chart looking at taka, to take, like geva, to give. But taka is affected by i-umlaut in the present singular, whereas geva is not. Since geva has just e, a front vowel in its root, there's no difference in the present singular. It's ek gev, thu gevr, that gevr, ver gevum. But taka has a, so that a is going to become e in the present singular by I-mutation. Ek tek, thu teker, that teker. I take, you take, it takes. Then we're going to go back to the root vowel in the present plural because there's no I there historically to change it. But there is a U in the first person plural, so that A does turn into hook O. So we take is ver tokum, because A turns into hook O by U. But then we go back to ver taki, thou taka. Y'all take, they take with the A. Then in the past tense, we have the same endings as with geva, but this is a different class of strong verb. This is a class 6, so the vowel in the root changes in a different way from geva. So ek tok, I took, thu tokt, you took, that tok, it took, and then the same endings as normal, but with a different vowel change, of course. Ver tokum, ver tokuth, thou toku. Present participle is, as usual, taking, takandi. The past participle teken, note that has i-umlaut too. You won't always see that in past participles and strong verbs. You will if the root ends in a k, g, or ng. This is, of course, taken, right? Much like English taken. Talk, to take. I mean, take like I'm commanding you, take it. Takiv, telling multiple people to take. Tokum, let's take. Notice in the subjunctive forms, which of course we'll do another video more about the subjunctive, but notice just to begin with, ek hig at hon taki, I think that she takes. Notice that the subjunctive form has an I, but that I doesn't cause i-umlaut. It's because the I in the subjunctive wasn't E in Proto-Norse. Ek hig at hon taki, notice that this I does cause i-umlaut because it has a different origin, or there was a J in the subjunctive that caused i-umlaut in the past subjunctive of strong verbs in the past. And notice that this is the i-umlaut of the vowel in the root in the past plural. So when we deal with subjunctives in a later video, that'll be important to remember that it's the vowel in the past plural form that gets i-umlauted to form the past subjunctive. So I think that she took. I don't know if she took. If I knew she took, I would say hon tok. Okay, but how do we find out what vowel to change the root into in the past tense? Well, that depends on what class of strong verb it is. So let's wrap this very long video up by looking at the classes of strong verbs. Alright, so typically in Germanic linguistics we talk about 7 classes of strong verbs. Although class 3, there are 2 main subclasses, 3A, 3B, and then class 7 is kind of a leftover grab bag of verbs that don't always have that much to do with each other. But basically what you're looking at here is you have the infinitive of a sample verb from each class. So driva, to drive, for instance, is class 1. Then you have the third person singular form. So the form that he did, she did, right? He drove, he creeped, he became. Then you have the third person plural form. They drove, they creeped, they became, and then you have the past participle. Driven, crept, have crept, become, have become, etc. So in each class, sorry, I had a weird notification there. The verbs in that class will follow this pattern with small exceptions here and there that are often conditioned by other sound changes. So for instance, a strong verb that has a long I in its root, driva or rida, to ride, will follow this pattern. So the past third will have ei, so drev, he drove. The past plural will have a short I, so drevu, they drove. And then the past participle will have a short I too, driven, just like English, right? So same thing with rida, to ride. Rida, reid, redu, ridden. So a verb that has a long I in the root and is a strong verb is diagnostically a class 1. Class 2, these are going to be those that have either U or yo, J long U or J long O in the root. So I've used smurga because that's easy to remember because of the association with Smeagol, right? This is to creep precious. The past tense is smaug, which of course J.R. Tolkien gives to another character, the dragon that crept, but that's like he crept, she crept. Smurgu, they crept, and then smogen, they have crept, the past participle. So other verbs that have you or yo in them will work the same way. So kyosa, to choose, past third singular will be kaus, she chose. Kuru, with the Werner's law mutation of S to R, they chose. And koren, kuren, they have chosen. Class 3, these 3A, these verbs will have an E in the root and then 2 consonants following it. So in this case you have E and then R and Ev. So here the past singular will have an A, so varð, he, she became. The past plural will have a U, urðu, they became. Notice the U here doesn't have a V in front of it because V always disappears before U in Old Norse. You can also see that in words like ulver for wolf, and the V disappears before O too, so a word like ormer for worm, orth for word, often the English word has a W there where the V is dropped out in Old Norse. And then orðin, you'll have an O in the past participle. He, she has become. There are some verbs of the 3A class that have a mutation called breaking, where the short E has become a J A or J long A. An example would be hjálpa, to help. But even though these look different in the present plural, they look the same in the past. So the past would be halp, helped, he, she helped, hulpu, they helped, holpen, they have helped. 3B are like 3A. They have 2 consonants after the root vowel, but the root vowel in 3B is an I, not an E. So vinna, to work or to win. Past tense, third singular, van, he, she, won. Past tense, third person plural, unu, they won. Again, with the V dropping out before U. And unen, they have worked. They have won. Other verbs that have so the strong verbs that have an I and then 2 consonants work the same way. So finna, to find, fan, fundu, fundin, with the same vowels in the same slots. Class 4, you'll have E in the root and then R, L, M, or N. This is bera, to bear or carry. Past tense, third person singular, bar, he, she, it carried. Past tense, third person plural, boru, they carried, and then boren, they have carried, they have borne, right? Often these do look like English words, right? So then another word like nema, to take or to learn, that has an E and then 1 consonant that's R, L, M, or N after it will work the same way. So nema, nam, nolmu, and then numen, because the ones that end in M or N have a U in the past participle instead of an O. Old Norse is always kind of a den of knives. And then geva is a class 5. These are like class 4s. They have an E in the root and then a consonant, one consonant. It's not R, L, M, or N. So geva to give, we've already seen this. Past tense, third person singular, gav. He, she, it gave. Golvu, they gave, given, given, has given. Class 6 will have an A in the root and then a single consonant. So fara, to fare, to go. For, third person singular, past. He, she, it went. Foru, they went. Faren, gone, they have gone. Past participle. Taka works the same way. We saw that example. It's a class 6. Taka, toku. Then we have teken with i-umlaut in the past participle because the root ends in a kg or ng. Like I mentioned before, class 7 is kind of a grab bag. It's a little bit hard to make generalizations about this class. In Gothic, this class has some features that are no longer present in Old Norse, like reduplication in many of these verbs. Old Norse resolves these verbs in all kinds of different ways, so it actually ends up being a better practice to just sort of learn the most prominent class 7 verbs for themselves. The first 3 that always come to mind for me are full, to get, it's past tense. Third person singular is fek, he, she, it got. Fengu, they got, plural past. Fengen, gotten, I have gotten. Then there's ganga, to walk or to go. Fara is the normal verb for traveling. Ganga is the word for walking or for sort of metaphorically going, like asking how it's going. Past tense third singular, like full, it's gek, he, she, it went. Walked, gangu, they walked. Gangen, I have walked. And then heta, this means to be named. Het, he, she, it was named. Hetu, they were named. Heten, have been named. This verb can also be used in a active sense to mean to promise. So he, she, it promised, they have promised, this thing is promised, something like that. So notice that in each of these cases I have not shown the present singular that has i-umlaut because that's always predictable. You know the ju is going to become a long y. You know the long I, the e, the I, the e, the e, you know those aren't going to change by i-umlaut, neither is ei together. But you know that fara, that a is going to turn into a short e because of i-umlaut in the present singular. You know that full, that long a is going to turn into an ash in the present singular because of i-umlaut. And you know that in ganga, that short a is going to turn into an e in the present singular because of i-umlaut. So keeping in mind i-umlaut and keeping in mind this chart, you can then construct all of the forms of the verb if you just put one of these in each corner. So let me wrap up this introduction to Old Norse verbs by looking at verbs of a couple different classes. Let's take driva as our first example after looking at the classes of strong verbs. So after looking at that chart, let's say you've never seen driva before, but you know it's a class 1. So you know that it's past third singular is drev, its past third plural is drivu. You also know that all verbs have just the root plus id, a in the present plural, so that's sort of free. It's a strong verb. It's not going to have i-umlaut because long I is a front vowel already. It's not going to be fronted by i-mutation. So you know that it's just going to be ek driv, I drove, I drive, ek, or thu driver, you drove, han driver, he drove, so like geva without i-mutation. What these do is they're like the nails and the plank that hold the whole plank down. If you break this into sort of 4 planks, this gives you the vowel for the rest of this square. So you know then that this is ek, drev, thu, dreft, because you know the third person singular is drev. Similarly, because you know the third person plural is drivu, that the first person plural will be drivum with the same vowel, and the second person plural will be drivu with the same vowel. Okay, same thing with smuga, but this is a verb that does have i-umlaut in the present. Again, you know that the present plural is going to have the endings id, a just attached to the root. Those are free. And from our chart, it's a class 2, so you know the third person singular past is smauch, and the third person Plural past smurgu. So you've got your boards and your planks. You know that because this is AU, that it's going to have the same thing in the other form. So ex smaug, thu smaugt. And you know this is going to be the same vowel in the other forms of the verb in the past plural. So smugum, smuguth, we crept, y'all crept, they crept. And then in the first person singular, you can see this has J long U in the root. You know that J long U is going to become long Y by i-mutation in the present singular. So you know you're going to get ek, smig, thu, smeager, han, smeager. I creep, you creep, he creeps. Alright, well that's all the time that I can give to a video today, but I think that if you are unfamiliar with or just starting out with Old Norse, that will give you a pretty good overview, a good jumping off point for dealing with verbs in the future. And of course, if you've already studied Old Norse in the past, and I hope also this might have helped you organize your thoughts about this a little bit better and understand the language and its system. I will continue at different points to post more videos about Old Norse, organize something like this. I'll include more information about verbs. We need to go over subjunctives. I may eventually do videos with something like practices that you can try. I don't know, we'll see. I really don't have time to like grade people's homework. But if you're a Patreon supporter, feel free to email me about examples. That is something that I can help you with. For now, from the University of California, Berkeley, I'm wishing you all the best.